James von Klemperer and the growing scale of urban projects.
Thank you, Professor Nosa.
I was given this title. I hope it suits you.
We changed it 5 times, but it's as good as any. Thank you all I hope you had a good lunch, and we all enjoyed a very robust set of presentations this morning of beautiful Milanese design. This afternoon, I think we've been asked to talk a little bit about towers in an international sphere. And so I don't know who controls the images here. Is there a, thanks. Thank you. So, going to begin talking about, not about so much about the form of tower and structure of towers, but about the social life that can be brought to towers, in particular, elevated social life, elevated gathering space. There were a lot was discussed at the end of this morning about the importance of society in regulating or encouraging what happens as a result of high-rise buildings. And the Torre Guinigi in Lucca is, although 700 years old, quite advanced in underscoring the interface between the tower and the sky, and in particular, the activity, not just of a family, but of a city, or of today, of visitors. But I believe even when the Guinigis built the building in 1300, they wanted people to come and enjoy themselves. And almost in this case, to have a more than normal experience, a heightened experience, we could say, perhaps even a metaphysical experience. Reminds us a little bit of the fantasy cities of Italo Calvino, we'll talk about a little bit later. So, going back in time, not to 1300, but in the history of the high-rise, we know the early load-bearing building of the Monadnock in Chicago on the left, Hullabird and Root, and conversely, a completely glassy building of Mies van der Rohe and Philip Johnson, 1960-ish, the Seagram's building, are buildings which, whether heavy or light in appearance, are really engines of commerce. They are machines of production, of office work that are closed to those who do not work for some Chicago trading company on the left or for the Seagram's company on the right. So, of course, the high-rise building does create all sorts of opportunities for networks. And we think of these primarily at the base of building. This kind of well-known diagram of central Hong Kong, where a number of us architects have practiced, shows us this, if you will, if you think of the tower as a tree, the root ball of connection of social and urban and commercial in a broader sense, not the company, but the whole society really flowing through in Hong Kong, the bridges and the tunnels that are like the roots of the high-rise building. So that's at the base. I want to talk more about what happens above. And so now, to go to an illustration that was made for the Città Invisibile, or the Invisible City of Mr. Calvino, some artist decided he would illustrate Calvino's thin city, city of memory, city of desire. But it's very apt, very appropriate, because this network draws our imagination beyond the confines of the site of any one building. So we think of this as a kind of provocative diagram. And indeed, walking around Milan, which I was having a nice time the last few days, looking up to the tops of many buildings where the suggestion, because of planting, and we have all been looking at the Bosco Verticale and several very nice buildings this morning where green brings some idea of life more than enclosed life into a building, but still quite private. So some of the projects, I will show you now some of KPF's work, but before I do, and it's mostly mixed-use work. Some of it is commercial, some residential, but given the needs of advancing some ideas of public housing, that's an area which kind of complements the work I'm going to show you. And this shows you the work of actually some students at Yale University, where we were teaching a studio in the conversion of New York City public housing. Housing towers you see on the left, for about 700,000 people in New York live in these buildings. And the research project we undertook at Yale was how could we fertilize, inject, and infuse different kind of program into the upper floors of such buildings. So this is beginning thinking about a vertical social world in an otherwise very drab, a little depressing setting. So, and then one last image of walking around Milan the last few days. Of course, the top of the Pirelli Tower, and whether Nervi or Gioponti, but quite novel, quite adventurous idea of liberating the top of a building. Nothing new to you all, but something that we've always loved as students and as practitioners of architecture. So I want to go through, for the next 15 minutes, 4 or 5 projects which are from our office design, and from mostly from my design, of buildings that are either complete or they are under construction. So these are not fantasies. They are coordinated, negotiated pieces of architecture. And ask the question, how do these buildings advance some idea about vertical social life? First, here in Hong Kong, we could look at a sort of a diagram of circulation bringing you up the building with escalators in this kind of diagonal fashion. This is in the Causeway Bay part of Hong Kong, a project known as Hai San Place. And the building is quite an interesting kind of diagram in its anatomy of circulation, of functions which move from bookstore to other retail to variety of office space to eventually headquarters for the Lee family. And in the middle is this big window. So drawing you up the building is this kind of diagrammatic configuration of escalators. So you can see from the street in the Causeway Bay the movement of people, or inside the building, the mixing of a big 3-story bookstore with constant flow of people with other functions above is very kind of open, urban. And that was the idea. There's a blending or a erasing of the lines between those who rent and those who use publicly, or public and private. And then you can emerge at areas of green, not so unusual, but very robust, very heavily used. And then not just during the day, but in the evening, so that that time factor, which is so important for public life, is extended, very much welcome in Hong Kong. The next project of 4 or 5 projects I want to show you is in Singapore. And this is just a little office building. We have our office, our own KPF office there, actually. But what's unusual about the project is the way that the building seems to separate in its lower third section. The building pulls apart, if you will, to create a terrace which is mandated public space. So the city of Singapore, the URA, the planning authority, says, if you build a building on a site with green, you must replace 100% that green somewhere in the building, usually higher up. So this building was part of an initiative that launched a program which became law of elevated public space. So this is available all hours of the day to anybody. You don't have to rent space there. You don't have to be a banker or a lawyer. And so the structure becomes a very important part of the expression of that space, the enjoyment of the space, and of course physically makes it possible. Then at the top is another space which is sort of an accompaniment to that lower zone, which is a walk-around forest that goes around the core of the building. And those windows, that glass is part separated to create open winds that go through the space. It's carefully calibrated. The next project is we're sort of moving up in scale. Is a project that looks very closed. This is in Shenzhen, so just across the border from Hong Kong. And this is a headquarters for one of China's most important companies, China Resources. And this company was initially the banker for the Communist Party when Mao was still marching on the Long March. So you can imagine, this is almost like being a company that started the Vatican or something in Rome. It has a special status. So the structure and the geometry of the building is really there to enclose mostly office space, but at the top is a space which is the result of this kind of kaleidoscope of elements of structure that come together in one point. So all of those lines which run vertically are structural lines. They're all steel from the bottom to the top, and they're outside the floor. It's an exoskeleton. And so at the top, for any of the ceremonial events that happen for Shenzhen business, and a lot of it government business, is this cathedral-like space. So here it's almost the concentration of the architectural power of the design that makes this a place that has significance. And indeed, the construction of it was marvelous. The technique of steel is not a normal high-rise building material in China. It's mostly concrete. And this is an exception in order to create this very, very fine sort of almost like a modern Gothicism, Gothic expressions of points and lines which come to the top. So we'll just zoom over the top and then continue on in our last couple of projects. There we go. Okay, I don't know, those must be satellite dishes. So, also in China, a project which started construction more than a year ago is in Chengdu. Chengdu being a major city in the west of China. You see the little green marks here on the diagram. Those are designating gardens. So the program for the city, which is part client, it's a government company, is to bring people through the tower. And the spiral is not literal, there's no spiral stair, but it indicates a way in which we can graduate from lower to upper. And when we gave the competition design to the city, we talked about what to them was the most important agenda for the project, which was the program of one belt, one road. Might not be so well known in Shanghai, or rather in Milan, but it was a major program of many tens of billions of dollars for the Chinese government to encourage growth to the west. So this building, in a way, is a picture of the nation of China because of this westward gateway. And each of those different atrium gardens has a different garden horticulture that applies to a different part of China. So this is Jiangsu province, Suzhou, or here further in southern China, a different kind of garden, or this garden, a garden of wood, maybe more about the north. And at the very top is a garden of light and of air. And this will be a city space. So this, as powerful maybe as many piazza spaces in a city at the ground. This is not yet built, but it's under construction. So in a few years, we'll be able to walk through that. Next to final in New York, the Vanderbilt Tower, which is the tallest office tower in New York. The very top of any building in New York is always a subject of whether the effect on the skyline has some significance. And here, the making of an idea about the mirroring, you'll see in a moment, is the theme. The building, by the way, is built over tracks that feed to Grand Central. It connects to public transit, so the ground level is the most important part of the project, without a doubt, for the public. But that ground level connects directly through shuttle elevators to the top. This shows you some graduated steps along the way. You don't have to stop here, but that's the third floor. And then at the top is an area which an artist, a Japanese artist, Kenzo, and some other artists display, but this main show is one of the kind of infinity of visual understanding of the city. You don't know where the ground is, you don't know where the sky is, you don't even feel you understand where your feet are, and you have vertigo. But it other than having some interesting, precipitating some interesting thinking, it's also a huge draw for the public. So over 1.5 million people have come even in the first year to visit this building because of the top. And it's a public draw. Finally, the North Bund Center. This is a a project also is in Shanghai of a national agenda. The ultimate client is a man named Li Qian. If you follow Chinese politics, he is the president of China sitting underneath Mr. Xi. So this project is very much supposed to be an expression of the generosity of the city government to Shanghai, and at the top is a space, which probably is the largest public space in any tall building, not only in plan, but in section, large enough to accommodate a symphony orchestra performance, the presentation by the mayor, a graduating ceremony for a university, and it's really about the architecture, about the generosity of these arches that say something about public life and public participation. So I'll just finish up thinking about this top of the building and going back to the Torre Guinigi and think about the open face of the top of a building. This happens to be the top of the Hudson Yards project, which is our design, also over tracks, over the railroad. And you see this power of the open face of the building and the heavens, which is here up at probably about 400 meters. And it ultimately is, even though it's a private property, it's open. You have to pay to get up there, but it becomes almost a property signature of the city, as much so as the Torre Guinigi. And so there it is, the top of the Guinigi Tower with the tree. And I'll finish with one image of a little project here in Milano, which our firm is designing with Coima in Lorenzini in Porto Romana. And it's only 5 or 6 stories. So it's not a high rise, but the important thing is there is a roof, and the roof tells you about your experience with the sky and your friends who came to enjoy the moment with you. And so we expect it to be a very powerful piece of the city when it's built. Thank you.